So yeah, initially going into prison, petrified. But we have this word that we use, institutionalized, or we become desensitized. And the more I went to prison and got out, the more I went in, I became more desensitized to what was going on in my life, was clueless as to why it was so easy for me to go back to prison.
In today's episode, I get to talk to Terrence Coffie. Terrence spent several years in and out of prison as a young adult. While he was there, he got enrolled in an educational program at the insistence of somebody who he looked up to while he was incarcerated. Since then, and since his release, he's finished his education at New York University and has been given the opportunity to teach some of the classes there. And he's about to start teaching at a prison education program as well. He's been involved in nonprofit work and helping the juveniles. His story has been well publicized. He was even in an interview with Katie Couric. The link for that interview, as well as Terrence's contact information, will be in the description below. If stories like Terrence's are valuable to you, to see people who have become successful upon release from prison instead of the despairing statistics you'll often see in the news and the media, subscribe to this channel, share it with people who you think might find it beneficial, and help me help others. Thanks. Well, thanks so much for meeting with me this afternoon. I know you're very busy. I am as well. Earlier we talked about midterms, so I am just finished a midterm, but I'm working to study for a final exam I have to take as a student, and then a final exam I have to administer as a professor in the prison out here in Texas. So I understand exactly what you're going through.
I think that's a very interesting space to be in, from student then transition to educator, all in the same vein. I was fortunate enough to be able to be a student, leave school, and then come back as an educator. I don't know what that looks like for you you're sitting in class and you're leading the class.
Well, it was even more ironic in my previous role. When I first started, when I first had the opportunity to come back into the prison system, I was working for a brand new bachelor's degree program, and I had not finished my master's degree yet, but I had finished enough that they were allowing me to teach the undergrad classes. Well, the instructors who were teaching the undergrad classes were also teaching my master's classes. And so the students and I were basically taking the same classes at the same time. I just had to write a few more pages for the masters, read an extra book versus them. So it was really a weird dynamic that we're basically reading the same stuff, and yet I'm an instructor for one or the other courses. It was fun. I loved that job. I'm in a new role now, but I loved that role.
Well, it's good to hear that. That's so great.
So I got introduced to you from Dr. Wright at Rice and UST, University of St. Thomas here in Houston. And you have an interesting story, obviously one that's compelling, being involved in education and having an incarceration experience. So I'd like to get to all of that. But if you could first start off just giving us some broad outlines of what your life was like before prison and led up to that event.
Well, again, I want to thank you so much and for having me here in this podcast, in this discussion. Let me first, prior to incarceration and all that part of my life, I actually grew up in foster homes. I grew up in some pretty poor and challenging communities, as you suspect, and as well, I was a ward of the state. So I had a couple of things going on during that process of my life that really shaped the way I looked at the world. And education really wasn't something that was a focal point, just to be clear. Coming from where I came from, and not only just the social environment or the environmental spaces I might have found myself in, was just also the way I internalized and view myself in life at that juncture, that education was not something that was a viable tool for young men such as myself coming through those situations and the communities came through as a stepping stone to something better, whatever that better was. That just wasn't the thing. I think that for me, as I said, growing up in foster homes, I learned to fight a lot. I got moved around a lot until I later got adopted. And I have to share that my adopted parents were very dedicated to the idea of success. They were very dedicated to the concept of education. But for me, that never was internalized because, with that, I was dealing with the struggles of being bullied, being called names, trying to fit in, find my own identity as a person, feeling like this charity case and always, like any other normal kid, wanting to be a part of, but being excluded in a lot of ways. And it was through actually violence. And I remember my first fight that I got in. I mean, I got beat up a lot of times, I got bullied, but there came a point when I actually fought back that the shift in how I saw myself, how I could be seen in the world was actually through that one fight. And from there, that began to, I like to say, evolve into my involvement with things that happened with my mom, used to call those bad boys, or and then that is what later led to my me leaving home at dropping out of school and leaving home, as we say, where I'm from, coming off the porch, and at 17 and by 20 years old, I was incarcerated for the first time in my life, and that is pretty much the nutshell of my childhood, finding that place in it. And for over 19 years of my life, until about age 39, I lived my life recycling through our criminal justice system until about 39 years old.
It's a common theme, at least of instability, just being moved around a lot, not having just a stable home environment and direct instruction. I went to prison out of high school, basically juvenile and then eventually prison straight out of high school. So what was that like then for you? Had you had family or friends who had been incarcerated? Were you familiar with what that was going to be like? When you first did your first bid in prison or jail, what was that like for you?
No. Interesting enough, no one in my adopted family had ever no involvement with the criminal justice system. I'm considered what the black sheep of the family in a good way, but sometimes not so good at that time. And as far as what I knew about prison is what I saw on television. Movies like old movies called Penitentiary, and they had the Scared Straight programs, and you seeing these. Yes. So I was, even at 20 years old, I thought prison was that, and in a sense it is, but not to the extreme. That was really I don't even say that was an extreme version. That was a one glimpse into what, when we think about maximum prisons and et cetera, it was back in the 70s, and you got these big sweaty dudes, and and I'm like, I was petrified.
Yeah.
When I say I was petrified, because the only thing I knew again about prisons is what I had saw. But interesting enough, I was sharing on a earlier radio show, one of the things that happened during that, when I initially was arrested, it was around the time of the 94 crime bill. And there was this aggressive, the tactics of our law and law enforcement agencies had really changed, and they became very, very aggressive, not only in the over-policing in the communities, not only in some of the brutal assaults and stuff that we now see on television, and we gasp and like, oh my God, that was a normalcy. For me, where I came, there was no concern on that community or what was happening outside of the drugs, police brutality, and all that stuff was, it was just part of what we thought was that's just the way it is. As Tupac said, that's just the way it is. So it was accepted. It was accepted by our communities, and it was accepted by me and so many other young men. So when I first went to prison, as I said, petrified. And the odd thing about it, you saw a roundup of so many other young men and from our same communities, from other communities, same thing, and all of us. Brandon, went into that space petrified. I remember, before you go to prison, you get sentenced. So you're sitting in county jail and, all of it, it's kind of like you and I are looking at each other now, but somehow we both knew that this was a new experience, and somehow we knew what we knew from what we saw on television. So something is going to happen. And this is where the idea, where I come from, we had these thing called bumblebees. It was like, if you fight one of us, then you're going to have to fight all of us, because in that unspoken language, we had determined that we had each other's back. I'm from Soul City, ... We from Duval County, Dade County. But that was almost that protective shield that we put around one another as young men going into this thing called the prison system. And the only thing we knew at that juncture about prison was what we saw on television. And however, going to prison, it wasn't what, we had imagined it to be. And although, we still held that camaraderie with one another, to support one another, to have each other backs in this environment. And that's where, again, as I like to share when we talk about the bumblebees, where, when one of us get in a fight from, whether it was from our city or our block, or if you're from a certain county, it was sectioned off, just like when we think about race, when you talk about, the whites with the whites, the Latins with the Latins, blacks with the blacks, that area. It was the same way in those prisons, also based upon where you were from. If you were from Dade County, Palm Beach County, everybody knew. So that was what that was about. And initially going into prison, petrified. But we have this word that we use in this circle that we're in our community, called institutionalized, or we become desensitized. And the more I went to prison and got out, the more I went in, I became more desensitized to what was going on in my life. I was clueless as to why it was so easy for me to go back to prison, based upon the laws and legislation, whether it was probation reform, whether it was issues related to substance use, whatever those other factors were. And then the external factors, again, unaware of trying to get a job and not understanding a social stigma that had been added to our lives through that 94 crime bill, as Joe Biden so eloquently put it on the Congress floor, that this is a cadre of young men, and we were deemed super predators in society. So there was this fear of young Black males from from our communities that began to restrict not only our abilities to reintegrate back into society, but it also began to impede upon us in some of the most substantial ways when we started thinking about employment, higher educational opportunities, when we started thinking about housing issues, when we started thinking about some of the basics as having licenses and so. But again, we were oblivious to this, but the more these doors closed, the more you almost felt like you were trapped in this radius of where you were from. And then you were pretty much kind of put back in a space of doing what you needed to do to somehow make ends meet, or, become that provider. And, and at that time, since we began to understand the way the world was addressing us, and, this is where a lot of the study of Tupac Shakur's music comes in. And most people don't like to acknowledge it, but I think there was a study that what he did at Harvard University, and that belief system of knocking on the door for opportunity, knocking on the door, and not letting those individuals be a part of that began to resonate in not only just my life, but in so many other men's and women's lives across this country, so much so that it was only in 2016 here in New York State that I testified at the fair hiring thing for the ban the box legislation, which made it illegal for employers to discriminate against someone who has a criminal background, because that practice had been taking place unbeknownst to those, to us at the time. But after some investigation, we found this through the EEOC. So I was able to testify in that. So that's just one of many aspects. We're not going to get into what that looks like for voting rights. We're not going to get what that looks like if you're from the projects and you get back out of prison. You can't go back to that, because federal housing is governed by federal law under the 94 crime bill that says if you're convicted of crime, you cannot. We're not going to talk about those same individuals who come from those poverty-stricken communities, going back to those communities under the 1996 Personal Responsibility Act, which restricted those men and women from accessing federal benefits such as TANF, food stamps, et cetera, the very programs that were designed to assist those individuals who fell 400, 300, 200, 600% below the poverty line. So those were some of those external factors. And again, I'm not even going to go to the social ramifications and the collateral damage that took socially in the way we were viewed as people.
Well, that's a lot.
That's a lot.
Yeah. So just a few things. Number one, yes, when I was incarcerated first at 16 years old, and I had all of the movies on my mind, and that's what I thought. And it seemed like every level up I went, I thought, well, surely it's going to get crazy at this point. My juvenile experience wasn't that bad. Then I went to city jail, then I went to county jail, then I went to state jail, then I went to prison. And, I guess part of the desensitization, I had already been running around in the streets. So there were fights, there were stabbings, but it just seemed to me like every level up I was able to manage, and it wasn't as bad as I had thought. However, that being said, my final bid in prison was minimum security. It wasn't maximum. So maybe I was blessed in that sense and to not experience the raging sort of violence. But it's certainly something that occurs especially down here in Texas. Texas is pretty notorious for its violence in the prisons. And it's interesting you brought up Tupac, because how YouTube just sort of their algorithm starts to recommend stuff for you.
Yes.
And it started recommending some Tupac interviews where he's giving his analysis of societies like when he's a teenager, talking about becoming an adult. And then, his analysis at the time back in the 90s and different interviews. So it's interesting you said that. When I was listening to Tupac, I didn't care about his analysis of society. It was just his music. But lately I've been finding these little snippets of interviews he did where he was very socially aware
of what was going on. And I have to say the same thing for you. And then, it was later that I could look at his and listen to his music from a very different perspective and understand that through it, he was describing some of the social complexities that when we talk about the environmental conditions and environmental factors and the social challenges for people from that community. And I think that his music resonated in a way that it did because he spoke. It was a thread that all of us could find, whether you were black or white or whatever. If you came from that type of environment, which, were being deprived of opportunities or feeling marginalized within yourself, even if you were in a predominantly wealthy community. There was this thread of music that he was able to find these identifying markers in human beings that spoke to a much more broader conversation on the failure of our system. And in one of his interviews, he said something very interesting in regards to a gentleman, I think, who shot at him or whatever it was. He said, "No, I don't blame this guy. I blame the system." Because a lot of times we can look at the individuals without thinking of this from a broader perspective as to the whys of it. And these are some of the things that Brian Stevenson brought up in one of the most recent documentaries, True Justice, where when his father was killed by a 16, 17-year-old, stabbed about a TV, and his family, although they said what happened with the youth was wrong, they began to ask much more broader questions. Why was our family in the ghettos of Philadelphia? Why did we have to move there, even though we had the resources to live in other places? Why did being in this place of absolute poverty with these young men, but that was the word because of absolute when we start thinking about poverty and what that meant, and then the psychological and traumatic implications of what poverty does to individuals in the way we perceive the world when you come from poverty, as opposed to someone who may have not, who may have grown up with those resources as opposed to those who haven't. So that's another aspect.
Sure. So in the midst of, incarceration and violence and poverty and trauma and all these different things, there was something that encouraged you to pursue education at some point. And so now you're working your way through the academic system, you're teaching. What was it that led you or motivated you to say, I need to educate myself?
Chin. He was like, who the hell is Chin? During one of my last bids, I was at Marion Correctional Institution, and in prison you get work assignments, as you may know, and my work assignment was in the boiler room. One of the things that I have to acknowledge is that during my time after being adopted, my adopted mom would make us read all the time. I hated her for it. We couldn't go out and play. We had to read a book, and then she would make us come back and explain to her what we had just read without the book. So it was one of the strangest things when I think of it now, what she was doing at that time. So I love reading. I really just love reading. I was fascinated with politics, and that's just like that dream. One day I'm going to be a legislator. I'm going to that's where I thought power was at. I was fascinated with certain types of movies that deal with political drama, but that was my stuff. I figured that's just what you do on the side. That's my kick it stuff. And every day that I would go to the boiler room, one of the officers would give us the paper, and I would go right to the political section and business news, and I'll be reading through this, and I'll be kicking it with Chin like, "Yo, these mother, you know what they mean? I'm just talking shit. You know how we talking shit, but at least I'm doing it, with something logical." And one day, Brandon, I remember coming in, and this dude didn't say nothing. He kind of, I came in with had my USA Today. I'm coming in and telling him about this shit going on in Washington and the bullshit that they doing. Yeah. And he looked at me just as clean. He said, "You need to get your young ass in school." He said, "You need to take your young ass to school." And I need to tell you, at that moment was probably the most interesting. It was one of the most interesting moments for me, because I need to tell you, in growing up, what I wanted to grow up, once you become thugged up and you get tattooed up like me, and you don't heard Tupac, I'm gonna ride till I die. I wanted to die to be an OG. That was that's what my aspirations had become. Yeah. Chin was the aspiration of what I wanted to become as an OG. He was a gentleman doing a 30-year bid. And I think he was like 50 something, so he'll probably die there. but I wanted to be like him because he was an OG. He giving back to the young bloods and da. So we would kick it like that. So when somebody like Chin say to me, you need to get your young at school, it really wasn't a question, like, it was a decision. He has just said, what the hell you going to do?
Yeah.
That's what happened in that. So I only got involved in the prison education program because Chin told me to, not because I thought I was going to be good at it, not that I thought that I was smart enough, not that I thought any of that. I went because Chin said, you need to get your young ass to school, and there was no way I was coming back to the boiler room talking about whatever the hell, because at that point, you ain't finna hear that. We ain't, that conversation, what has been said has been said, and I respected him like that. And I got into the prison education program, and when I earned my GED, I had one of the highest scores in the state that year. And unfortunately, even to this day, I have never had the opportunity to thank him. So every time I do an interview like this, I say him to pay homage and acknowledge when people ask me, because most individuals, they see a lot of the achievements that I've done today, and they somehow assume it was some historical factor, individual, whatever may have been the causation of my first entering school. But it was at the request of Chin that I actually entered school. I think the second major factor that I do have to acknowledge that set me, because I had earned my high school diploma, I had gotten out, and there was those experiences that you and I just described. When I got out and I had now earned this high school diploma, I felt like I had earned a college degree, because before that, you would go in there, would ask you, do you have your high school diploma? And I would always have to say no. And you always have that, feeling, whatever that feeling was. And I remember having this high school diploma and feeling like that somehow I had earned a college degree. And somehow, because I read a lot of Malcolm X, education is the key to tomorrow's future for those who prepare for it today. And I took that literally, because I come from, you have to remember, I come from that broken place. So opportunities and success was not familiar to me in this line. So I believed that stuff. I somehow knew that I was the failure in it, because I had not achieved those things. But so once I achieved my high school diploma, I felt equipped to deal with and be able to navigate through this thing called the United States of America of society, whatever one wants to call it. And I remember getting out. I remember my family being proud of me, getting my high school diploma. And I remember feeling empowered. I remember getting my first tie and my dress shirt, and you're going to go to an interview and I had read these books on how to do a good interview, and you look the employer in the eye and you give a firm hand. I read this because now, after that happened, I wanted to prepare myself, because I felt like I had something to go with now. I had something I could navigate with. And I remember going to my first interview. I remember filling out the application. And I remember I couldn't wait to get to the part where they asked, do you have your high school diploma? I was just like, I wanted to zip just to get to that. But yes, I got and to share all the great things I had done. And one other question was on there that I didn't pay much attention to, because I didn't. Just, have you ever been to prison? Yes, I didn't. It was not I even thought about it. It was just, okay, it was a question there. You be truthful, you be straightforward, you be an upstanding person. And so, but I figured, wait a minute, I got my high school. So that trumps anything else, because I did something good with my time. Yeah. I used it in a beneficial way. I became a teacher's assistant. I put all that stuff on there. Yeah. And I filled it out. The secretary gave it to the guy, and they called me into the room. And he didn't ask me about my background. He didn't ask me about my high school diploma. He didn't ask me about being a teacher's assistant in prison. He didn't ask me about helping countless other men, or how I had wanted a high school. I even got a letter of recommendation from Mr. Sanders, the program director. He was so proud of me. told me you're going to do good. However, the social narrative had been written about men like me now. The social stigma was set in place. And I remember that first employer looking at me, and he didn't ask me none of the things I just described to you. The first thing he stated to me, I noticed you've been to prison. And unfortunately, our company policy does not permit us to hire. And I was blown away, Brandon. Look, I could not wrap, because they didn't prepare us for it. And this is where I began to understand more in depth the impact of the language surrounding the 94 crime bill. It's where we became a liability to employers who were afraid that if hiring a formerly incarcerated person, that if we did something, their company could be sued because of a narrative that said we were violent, we were this and we were that, and all these things, rapists and murders. I'm like, yo, I sold drugs, man. I mean, I did some stuff, but I did. And you know, you kind of, there's a documentary called Locked In, No Longer Locked In, Just Locked Out. And it shows this young man going through these various doors of society after being released from prison, and every door is shut to him. Yeah. That became my reality. It became a reality that I lived. It became a reality when I thought that before this great move that happened years later, that I could go back to college. However, by the time I did that, that's when they told me, because of my drug convictions, I was not eligible for federal funding, which excluded me from that because my family didn't have no money to pay for college. So there I go. I remember the same doors being shut in the job market. I remember not, thinking, well, how do you're confused about this because you're just part of it now. And then I remember the day of saying, fuck this, not doing this. And then there's that decision that's made. You realize, because now you're hearing it through the music, you're seeing it in the street, and you're seeing everybody come home from where you just came home, and it's the same, and you don't really recognize what's going on. You kind of sense something is going on, but you don't get it. And it was that happened. So I wanted to be able to answer that question in a very concise way that reflects my point in regards to this conversation.
Well, there was a lot there. So first, you said Malcolm X, and now I got to thinking that, interestingly, so I've been listening to a lot of Malcolm X. I just finished the autobiography again. I watched the movie again. I'm just, for the last couple of months, been on this whole journey. And then YouTube recommending Tupac clips. And so the YouTube algorithm apparently thinks there's some similarity between Tupac interviews and the lectures of Malcolm X, the speeches of Malcolm X. It just clicked. As soon as you said that, I was like, wow, that's why they're sending me this stuff. It's very interesting.
Exactly.
What's also cool is that when I talk about education, people come into education for a variety of reasons. And in matter of fact, it was Malcolm X. Somebody told him he needed to start reading and get his education while he was in prison. Mm-hmm. There's so much value in older people like Chin, I guess, who they have that sort of experience. They're elders in a certain way. They have wisdom in a certain way, and then encouraging younger people to do better than them or to go a different route. And so there's a program called Credible Messengers, I think, that came out of New York State. It's out here in Texas now. Mm-hmm. But all of these are emphasizing the fact that there are people who have been through the system and are able to encourage, motivate, and mentor younger people as well. So however you came into education, it's just interesting that it was an older person who said, hey, you need to get your ass in school. And you did.
I got to share something with you on that train of thought. This is my favorite cup from a guy named Glenn Moore, and it says that people closest to the problem are also those closest to the solution. What you're describing is what we talk about. One of the theories is based in relational therapy, that an individual who has been through what I've been through has a higher success rate of reaching another person than anyone else, even with our academics and our accolades, based upon the one thing that person, the identifying marker is that lived experience. I feel that a lot of the legislation and work that's being conducted surrounding justice reform, education program, whatever it may be, they do not exercise enough of the resources that they have in individuals such as yourself, myself, in effectuating, creating programs, policies that are reflective of our lived experiences, because we know the system better than anybody getting out based upon our own lived experience. If we could take what we lived and bottled it, what we will find is a higher success rate of those individuals that are exiting our justice systems. One of the studies that I did on basically in regards to education, particularly for those individuals with justice involvement, is learning and finding that education is what we like to refer to as the Great Equalizer. Studies show that an individual who has access to higher education, even while incarcerated, is 80% less likely to get in any type of infractions. That individual is more likely to complete their sentence on time. That individual, and I'm just talking about with an AA degree, is 50% less likely to ever go back to prison. With a bachelor's degree, 25% less likely to go back to prison. And with a master's or doctorate degree, there is almost not a 0.003% of those individuals like that going back to prison. So with that said, it fascinates me that when we talk about reentry programs, we talk about the investment in our current criminal justice system. It behooves me to try to understand, while legislators have not grasped, if we have data, we have research that gives us this indicator, why are we not investing more in that area, which will reduce recidivism? And also, one of the other major factors, as I just said in relational therapy, is when an individual who's incarcerated has an opportunity to be educated by individuals such as ourselves who have went through that system. So we know what they facing. We know how to speak to them in a way of dealing with the day in, the day out. We got to tell you to keep your head up because it's the other side. And then through that, we also create opportunity, because we do not want to create programs that do not transcend to opportunity. And these are some of the other factors in regards to that that I just had to just chime in on once you mentioned that.
Yeah. Well, with that said, what you're doing now is you're teaching at NYU. You're doing classes in things like criminal justice, social work. You also have, what was it, Educate, Not Incarcerate. You started, is that an LLC, nonprofit, something you're doing with education versus art?
Yeah, Educate, Don't Incarcerate is an LLC, which I started as an undergrad at NYU. And it actually started as a POPs project at one organization I was working out for, the company needs assessment. And what I determined was that they had a great majority of their population of men that were being released to prison who had already achieved their high school diploma. So their educational programs that they had within the organization now went only up to obtaining a GED. And some of these men had aspirations of making the next steps. And because of the relationships that I had garnered and developed over the years with organizations such as College Initiative, so on and so forth, I set forth putting in, it was named the College Pathways Program. And that program provided support to men and women who wanted higher education. And that program was later adopted by the organization. And from that is where I developed the grassroots organization, Educate, Don't Incarcerate, because I wanted to continue that work of assisting men and women who were coming home with the resources and guides necessary for them to pursue higher educational opportunities. That is still the fundamental basis and premises of what we do at Educate, Don't Incarcerate. But over those years, we began to develop a more policy-driven focus. Because one of the things that my studies is, focuses on the macro level, policy reform, policy change. Because what I learned is that I can help one individual in helping them one-on-one, and then I'm going to help another individual with the same problem that this individual had, that the same 3, 4, 5. And through policy, what I learned is that if we can change the policy that governs countless lives, then it's almost like we're killing 35,000 birds with one stone by changing policy. And again, I will refer back to my involvement with the passage of the ban the box legislation that impacted over 38,000 people. And also my recent work with the Cattell Center and advocating for the Less is More Act here in New York State, which now focuses on, which actually after signed into law by Governor Kathy Hochul, will now eliminate sending men and women back to prisons based upon technical violations, which represented nearly 39% of the prison population here in New York State, costing this state alone close to $700 million a year in reincarcerating that population.
I had a question about education in particular. Do you think it's a particular kind of education that is necessary or transformative, or what, when you envision education being a part of the reform movement, what kind of education?
I think that the idea of educational reform is just as broad as what we know in Main Street. And that's another thing. I think that sometimes when we think about the prison population, we somehow forget that they're actually American citizens. They're just over here now, as opposed to over here. So just as broad as the opportunities that we have in any educational system are also the same type of opportunities that we need to have extended to those within our criminal justice system, because the same training will be used wherever they go. Sure. Now, there was a great debate, as you may know, and that almost, I don't know why it came back to my mind, between Dr. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass on the types of trainings. I believe, just like all Americans, some of us like college, some of us are better with hands-on training. I think that it's the responsibility of reformers, legislators, and particularly when we're talking about education, that we have just a broad of a scope to find out the talents of those individuals that incentivizes them, encourages them to want to get it. We have a lot of guys who want to be mechanics. You have guys who are better with their hands than they are with books. You have some guys who like to tinker. Me, I'm not a tinker. I just not my thing. I can sit and think. I'm not even athletic, so doing all that. But this, I think that we do not have to limit ourselves. I think that we have an opportunity to reimagine what that looks like, even in prison institutions. And I say that because from 1994 up to right now, as you're on here in this conversation, our criminal justice system has spent nearly $80 billion per year nationally to sustain a failed system. Now, I had one of my students the other day to do the math for us, and I think that came to like $2 trillion whatever dollars that we've invested over the past 30 years in a failed system. Now, my approach is, imagine if we're gonna approach the justice system in its current state from a humane perspective, from the idea of providing opportunity, and just as aggressive as our push to incarcerate and to create this carceral state that we currently live in. Just imagine if we're just as aggressive and imaginative and innovative in our ideas on what we can offer to the tune of $80 billion per year. Imagine what programs we could institute as opposed to expanding private prisons or contracts. Imagine what we can do with that money if we take a more sensible approach. Right now, the Biden administration, I almost just lost the name. I don't know. I keep thinking about Clinton. The Biden administration has recently released 5,000 low-level offenders from the federal prisons under the CARES Act. What that tells me that there are innovative ways in which we can incarcerate people without incarcerating people. What that tells me that those individuals that, they meet the requirements, and if you look at the guidelines for the requirements to qualify for the CARES Act, what you'll see, not a threat to society. Crime is not deemed a threat to society. They've gotten involved in various programs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're not deemed a threat to society. It's only when those individuals are deemed a threat to society or to public safety, it's when some legislator wants to go on his rant of law and order and being strong of crime. But when in the face of this pandemic we've been involved in, I think it has shown us what the possibilities, that there are more innovative ways for us to address criminality than confining people into cages and then expanding that system where we reach a place of what we call this mass incarceration, where now states and the federal, they're all backing back. So, okay, we got to do something different. So in doing something different, I believe in reimagining justice. I believe in innovators such as yourself. I believe that we have an opportunity to say, what will our prison systems look like 30 years from now? Will we have an approach that has reduced recidivism, introduced a very humane approach, and at the same time, have we truly provided the necessary opportunities to live out what we say as providing a true second chance?
Well, the reason I was asking about the education was basically getting at something you said, because at least in my understanding, my reading, my research, is that most of the educational programming in prisons is zeroing in on GED and vocational work, as opposed to history, psychology, economics, politics. It's all zeroed in on vocational work. And I am not opposed to trades and vocations, but I would like to see more. And there's any number of reasons why they focus on that. It's a more direct line from getting a CDL and becoming a trucker than giving a bachelor's degree in history and someone doing something in history. So there's reasons why they do that, but I think it really limits the kind of reform that could be had within the prison system. Because when I look at history like Malcolm X, or actually what you said earlier was Booker T. Washington is what I was thinking of, because he insisted that the students of Tuskegee build the dang thing because he thought that manual labor was still important in addition to your liberal arts, your politics, your economics. It was not an either or, it was a both and. And so I'm not opposed to trades at all. I just think that there needs to be more done there. And so when I think of Malcolm X or others who have had these educational transformation, it wasn't because they became welders. It was because they learned about literature and history and, things of that nature is what sort of changed what was going on up here. And so it's a passion of mine, if you can't tell, that I am not opposed to vocational trades at all, but I think more can be done, because you can be a great welder, and that says nothing to your civic participation, to your role as a father, any of those things. And you can be a good welder and also all of those other things. And, I think a lot of what the educational when it comes to prison reform, education is the way to go, but the particular kind of education needs to be much broader than
Exactly. And interesting enough that you said that they programs through Microsoft, Google, et cetera, actually were trying to extend their social programs to offer programs in coding and making some of the trainings within prison are transferable to a viable market for men and women. And ironically enough, for a lot of organizations, and this is strange, and I'll just leave it there for now. A lot of those organizations were opposed to offering those type of training by saying, well, the men don't have the fortitude or academic skill understanding set to understand this, which actually, again, for me, was quite challenging, because I probably would have been one of those men that they said that in regards to. So I'm always at that place of challenging the status quo of organizations or institutions which seek to somehow to rationalize the whys that this can't possibly be. I know that before we got into the need for Zoom meetings or Zoom courts or having et cetera, et cetera. So I know we can't give them computers because what they're going to do is tap and rob banks. And what are you talking about? They're going to tap into. They still got criminal behavior. So we can't give them a computer because we do that. They're going to be and let me say this. We can't continue to approach an entire population of people based upon a fraction of the people and make a determination that this is all of the people. And that is another form of another conversation that we have to continue to have with legislators and those individuals who are opposed our ideas and visions, because they'll take one isolated case or three, whatever that may be, a small fraction of individuals and justify that legislation that will govern the lives of over 5 million people.
So what does the future look like for you? What are you're teaching now? You've got different things going on that are emphasizing education over incarceration. What does the future look like for you? Because I know you've spoken about being involved in legislation there in New York State as well. So what does the future look like for you?
Well, as of today, through Educate, Don't Incarcerate, we're now establishing the Social Justice Network. And the Social Justice Network is going to be an internet radio show that is going to provide a platform for those individuals with justice involvement who would like to get into radio. Historically, our populations have been marginalized, and our conversations and voices have been stymied by, censorship or whatever you want to call that. So through the work that we're doing through the Social Justice Network and FetLife Station, starting in January, we're going to be getting that launch. So we're looking forward. So we have some tremendous partners that is behind us on this, and we're grateful that we don't have to, kind of bend ourselves to government grants that, have a tendency to restrict and put these requirements and stipulations on. So we're not doing that. Starting next semester, I will begin teaching at Wallkill Correctional Institution I shared with you earlier. So that's just simply a passion for me. But as far as policy reform and changes, I'm actually working on 2 projects. The first and foremost, we're working with agencies here now to develop the comprehensive reentry plan, which will be introduced to state, local, and state governments as a template that can be utilized by these governments in order to not only address reducing recidivism, but also implementing what we believe a sustainable project and plan that can help effectuate change in the way that they're hoping to seek to do it at those levels. And secondly, I'll be working with some groups here with the South Asian Bar Association and members of the Black Bar Association, where we'll be introducing a campaign and legislation to the Biden-Harris administration on repealing the '94 crime bill. We're very interested right now. We're very happy with the work that's happening with Senator Cory Booker's office and the reverse mass incarceration legislation, which we'll be signing on with that. And the main, and I would say outside of that, the last thing that we are definitely looking forward to is expanding the I Am a Credible Messenger's national campaign. And that campaign is focused on connecting formerly incarcerated men and women from across the country with one another and providing yet another platform for various trainings and also access to legislators from across the country, because what we believe in is uplifting, empowering, and really shining the light on the lives and work of those individuals who are doing this work across the country, because it goes back to what I initially said. We believe to educate, don't incarcerate, that those who are closer to the problem are also those closest to the solution. However, we're usually the furthest from the power and resources. And I want to use my platform, the things that I've been able to achieve as a mechanism to provide those opportunities, to open those doors to others, because I think that I think there are a lot of sharper tools in the box than me. So I think that hearing those voices and bringing those experiences to the forefront, it actually begins again, as I said earlier, one of the greatest challenges I think that we have and what we will be addressing is rewriting the narrative around the lives of those individuals with justice involvement, and to begin to put forth the conversation of reimagining what justice is and what it can be.
Well, I hope to be a part of those movements in some way. That's part of why I'm doing what I'm doing with the YouTube gig, is just, changing the narrative, the stereotype of people who are incarcerated or have been incarcerated in some way. To get away from the idea that we are all the villains you see in Hollywood, or super predators of the 1990s, but that we are capable of doing great things. And for many of us, not all, but for many of us, if not most of us, our incarceration experience were just the result of bad choices that are regrettable. And we want to do whatever we can to give back, but there just seem to be so many innumerable barriers in the way. So thanks for spending the time to talk to me on Saturday of all days. I know you got a busy schedule, and apparently I caught you off guard earlier. So
we made it happen, though. You know where we come from. When we take two bags of oodles and noodles, we get the little salsa, we get and we get the onions, and we make it happen.
Yeah, make something out of nothing.
We make something out of nothing.
All right. Well, thanks.
All right, my brother. Thank you. Yes.
Talk to you later.
Yep.